I'm 82 years old now, and before I say anything else, I want you to slow down for a moment and listen carefully. Not the way people usually listen while their mind is busy somewhere else, but the way you listen when something might actually matter to your life. Because what I'm about to tell you is something it took me most of my life to understand. And if someone had sat me down when I was younger and said these same words, I might have saved myself decades of chasing things that never truly gave me what I thought they would. My name is Daniel. I spent nearly 40 years working as a civil engineer, designing highways and bridges across 3 different states. For most of my life, I believed that if I kept climbing, if I kept achieving, if I kept pushing forward, eventually I would arrive somewhere that felt like peace, somewhere that felt like enough. When I was young, I had this picture in my head of what a successful life looked like: a respected career, a comfortable house, a steady bank account, people shaking your hand and saying they admire what you've accomplished. I thought if I built that life brick by brick, one day I would wake up and feel complete. But what no one told me was that the picture in your head keeps changing the closer you get to it. When I was about 12 years old, I watched my mother work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. My father had passed away when I was 9, and after that the house got very quiet. I remember watching her leave before the sun came up and come home long after dinner time. Her hands were always tired, and there were nights when she fell asleep in the kitchen chair before she even finished her tea. Something in me made a decision back then, a quiet promise to myself that one day I would build a life where money was never a worry again. I wanted security so badly that it became the center of everything I did. In school, I worked harder than everyone else. While other boys played ball after class, I stayed inside studying math books and drawing little sketches of bridges and buildings. Teachers said I was driven. They said I had discipline, but what they didn't see was that underneath all that determination was fear. Fear of ending up like my mother, exhausted and struggling just to survive. So I chased success the way some people chase safety. When I got into college to study engineering, it felt like the first big victory of my life. I thought I had finally started the journey toward the future I wanted. Nights in the library, weekends buried in textbooks, summers taking internships that kept me working 70 hours a week. At the time, it all felt meaningful. After graduation, I got hired by a construction firm. I was 24 years old, full of energy, and convinced that the next promotion would make everything feel settled. I told myself I would slow down once I reached a certain level. But what it really becomes is a habit of postponing your life. I worked long hours through my 20s. When I married my wife Clara at 29, I promised her things would calm down once my career was established. But the promotions kept coming, and each one seemed to demand more of my time than the last. Project manager, supervisor, then senior engineer. By my mid-40s, I had everything. But there were quiet moments late at night when I would sit in the living room and feel a strange emptiness I couldn't explain. I had climbed the mountain I thought mattered, yet the view at the top didn't feel the way I imagined it would. I told myself it was normal. That's the trick life plays on you when you believe happiness is something waiting in the future. The future keeps moving. I kept running because I didn't know any other way to live. I thought the running itself meant I was doing right. I didn't know if the finish line even existed. The voice that kept asking if I had done enough. But there's a quiet danger in living that way for too long, because eventually you forget how to exist without chasing something just ahead of you. By the time I reached my early 50s, my career had become the center of everything. I was traveling constantly, overseeing construction sites, sitting in meetings that stretched late into the evening, making decisions about budgets and deadlines that felt incredibly important at the time. My calendar was always full. My phone was always ringing. People depended on me, and I took pride in that. It felt like proof that I mattered. But while my work life kept expanding, something else was slowly shrinking without me noticing it. My wife Clara used to say that the house felt quieter even when I was sitting right there in the room. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I thought being present simply meant physically being in the same place. I would sit on the couch while she talked about her day, but my mind was usually somewhere else, replaying conversations from work or planning the next project. I wasn't trying to ignore her. I simply didn't know how to turn the engine of my mind off. One night when I was about 47, she said something that stuck with me in a way few words ever have. We were eating dinner at the kitchen table, and I had just spent 10 minutes talking about a highway expansion project, and it had gone over budget. I remember she put her fork down and looked at me very calmly. "Daniel," she said, "I feel like I'm living with someone who's always halfway out the door." At first I got defensive. I told her I was doing all of this for us, for the house, for the stability, for the future we had worked so hard to build. In my mind, providing those things was the same as caring for someone. But she shook her head slowly and said something that took years for me to fully understand. "I didn't marry a paycheck," she told me. "I married a person." At the time, I thought she was being unfair. I thought she didn't understand the pressure I was under. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. She didn't need me to bring home more success. She needed me to be there, not physically, emotionally. Looking back now, I realize how often I confused those two things. The years kept moving forward. My career kept growing just like I had always planned. By 55, I was overseeing several major infrastructure projects across 2 states. My name was known in the company. Younger engineers asked for my advice. I had become exactly the kind of respected professional I once imagined I would be. And yet the strange emptiness I mentioned earlier never fully disappeared. Every time I achieved something, the satisfaction lasted a few weeks, maybe a month at most. Then the feeling faded and another goal quietly took its place. Another deadline, another level of recognition to reach. I started to notice something during those years, something subtle but important. The excitement of achieving something new was getting shorter. When I bought my first house in my 30s, the pride lasted months. When I received my first big promotion, I felt proud for nearly a year. But later in life, the victories barely stayed with me. It was like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. For a moment, it feels like relief. But soon the thirst comes back even stronger. I didn't have the language to explain that feeling back then, but now I understand what was happening. I wasn't chasing success, I was chasing a feeling. The feeling that I was finally safe, finally worthy, finally someone who had proven his value to the world. The problem is that no amount of external success can permanently create that feeling. It might visit you for a moment, but it never stays. Around that time, I started noticing differences between the people around me. Some of my colleagues were exactly like I had always been. They were constantly comparing themselves to others, always measuring who had the bigger contract, the bigger house, the better title. Even when they succeeded, there was always a quiet tension in them, like they were afraid someone else might catch up. I remember one man in particular, Michael. He was incredibly wealthy by the time he turned 60. Multiple houses, luxury cars, the kind of financial security most people dream about. But every conversation with him eventually turned into complaints. Someone else had made more money. Someone else had been featured in a magazine article. It didn't matter how much he achieved. It was never enough. Then there were other people who seemed completely different. One of them was an older surveyor named Harold. Harold had worked in the same field for decades, but he had never chased promotions or prestige. He lived in a modest home, drove an old truck, and spent most of his weekends fishing by a quiet lake outside town. Yet every time I saw him, he seemed calm in a way that was almost mysterious to me. One afternoon, we were sitting on a concrete barrier at a construction site, watching workers pour the foundation for a new overpass. I asked him once, half joking, why he had never tried to climb higher in the company. He smiled and said something that puzzled me for years. "I already like the view from where I'm standing." At the time, I laughed it off, but his words stayed somewhere in the back of my mind, because I believed the view only improved if you kept climbing. But what if that wasn't true? What if the peace I thought was waiting at the top was actually something you had to learn how to feel wherever you already were? That question didn't fully change my life overnight. Realizations rarely do, but it planted a seed that slowly began to grow over the next decade. And eventually, that quiet question turned into something much bigger than I expected. By the time I turned 75, I had started to see the truth more clearly. It wasn't about the houses, the bank account, or the accolades. It was about presence, acceptance, and being fully here in the moments I was living. I had spent nearly 6 decades believing that happiness would arrive after some future achievement. But the funny thing about life is that there's always another thing. Every finish line is just a pause before the next race begins. I began to realize that what I had been truly chasing all along wasn't wealth, status, or respect. It was a sense of being enough, feeling worthy, feeling loved, feeling safe. And the most remarkable revelation was that those feelings were never out there in the world to be earned. They were always within me, waiting for me to notice and claim them. It took practice, and some days it's still a struggle. I have to remind myself that my worth isn't tied to the projects I finish, the titles I hold, or even the money in my bank account. I can be enough sitting on my porch in the morning, watching the sun spill over the rooftops without accomplishing anything else that day. I can be enough listening to the birds and drinking my coffee without needing a nod of approval from anyone. I began to understand that freedom, the kind of peace that lasts, is internal. It's a quiet confidence that the world's chaos and opinions cannot shake. I noticed it in friends who had reached my age and seemed lighter, almost untethered. They weren't wealthy or famous, and many were far from perfect, but they had a calmness I envied. Their lives were still full of problems, yet those problems didn't define their inner state. I started reaching out to those friends, listening more carefully to how they approached life. One of them, a retired school principal named Margaret, told me simply, "Daniel, I stopped running. I decided that the life I have right now is enough to live fully." That sentence stayed with me. It was so simple and so difficult at the same time. Simple because it made so much sense. Difficult because I had to unlearn 50 years of habit, the habit of measuring myself against others, the habit of believing satisfaction was always in the next milestone, the next paycheck, the next promotion. I began small. I started setting aside moments of each day where I simply existed without pressure to perform. I listened to Clara in ways I never had before, fully hearing her thoughts and feelings without letting my mind wander to work or responsibilities. I began noticing the small joys that I had always overlooked, the quiet laughter of children playing outside, the smell of rain on pavement, the way sunlight shifts through the trees, the slow pleasure of making a meal without rushing. And slowly, over months and then years, I began feeling a lightness I had never known. The tight coil of anxiety that had gripped me most of my adult life loosened. It didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer dictated my days. I started understanding something profoundly simple. You don't need to fix everything to feel safe. You don't need to achieve everything to feel worthy. You don't need permission from the world to feel love for yourself. All of those things are already inside you, waiting for acceptance. That was my revelation. The things I had been chasing externally were never the true source of the feeling I wanted. I could have given myself that feeling at any age, and yet it took me decades to understand it. I used to imagine that freedom would arrive when my bank account reached a certain number, when retirement was complete, when my health was perfect. But the truth is that freedom comes from letting go of the idea that you need something else to feel complete. It comes from stopping the chase. It comes from stopping the chase and allowing yourself to be present right now. I can tell you honestly, looking back at 77 years of life, that every day spent waiting for happiness to arrive is a day half lived. And I want the young people listening to this to understand it sooner than I did. You do not need to wait for promotions to feel enough. You do not need the world's approval to feel valuable. You do not need the perfect circumstances to feel content. All of that is already here inside you. And I can tell you from experience, the moment you stop running after the next thing and start noticing what is already present, your perspective changes. Life feels lighter, problems lose their sharpness, and ordinary moments start to carry extraordinary meaning. I still have my daily struggles, my small regrets, and days when old habits creep back in, but they no longer define me. I am learning every day to be enough, and to let the things outside me exist without giving them the power to disturb my inner peace. That is what real freedom feels like. It's the quiet smile that comes from knowing you are whole, even when everything around you is messy. It's being able to look in the mirror and say, yes, this is me and I am enough. I am not perfect and I never will be. But for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I am chasing an invisible finish line. And that, my friend, is the lesson I hope you take from my story. The chase will never end if you let it. Stop postponing your life waiting for something external to validate you. You already have what you've been searching for. The love, the worthiness, the peace, it's inside you. All you have to do is notice it, accept it, and let it guide the way you live every single day. If I could go back and tell my 25-year-old self what I am telling you now, I would. I would sit him down and say, Daniel, stop running, stop measuring, start noticing. You are enough. You always have been. And even though I didn't realize it until my 70s, the good news is that it's never too late to start. You can begin today. You can take a single moment, breathe, and allow yourself to feel that you are already enough. And when you do, the world shifts, the noise loses its hold. Comparisons lose their weight. Fear becomes just another passing thought. You can finally start to live the life that was already waiting for you, one quiet, present moment at a time.